That's something that we really struggle with, athletes, when we go into the workplace. We're used to doing things at, 98, 99% of our capacity. And then all of a sudden in the office, everyone's going at 7%, and we're just so confused.
Walter Reuther has a deep history here in Wheeling. Actually sort of left to go to Detroit because that was a common thing for people to do. He also had to leave because he tried to organize a union at Wheeling Steel, which was the main sort of corporation here in the 1920s.
The employers use the digital technology to collect enormous amount of information about who calls and when and what kinds of calls. And they use that then to squeeze out any downtime and to implement requirements that a call center worker can only be on the phone for a couple minutes.
They led the rally and the chants, and they said it with such conviction and so much. And the LCBO members who were on the picket lines that afternoon really appreciated the additional support and solidarity that they were getting from us. Yeah.
We put these online trainings on for anyone who wants to come. She attended one of these trainings and brought her coworkers, and through the resources we provided, built something and connected with NMU and was able to unionize her hospital, which for us was a really big win.
You're listening to the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, a selection of highlights from selected shows airing across the Labor Radio Podcast Network. More than 200 radio shows and podcasts focused on worker issues. You'll find out more at laborradionetwork.org. I'm Chris Garlock. On today's show, the Future of Work podcast explores the challenges facing athletes with disabilities. Labor History Today takes a labor walk in Wheeling, West Virginia. Debbie Goldman discusses her new book, Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Age, on the Heartland Labor Forum. Then, on the CUPE Cast podcast, Brianna and Brittany discuss the recent Liquor Control Board of Ontario strike. And in our last segment, the Reinventing Solidarity podcast talks with Megan Svoboda from the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. That's all ahead on this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, and as usual, we'll get things started with Harold's quick overview of shows you should know.
Thanks, Chris. Chris and Patrick work really hard to get all the great labor radio shows and podcasts that have come out in the past week into the weekly, but there is just so much that it's impossible to get it into a half-hour show. So here's a few more shows you should know. The Library of Congress's America Works is back with an interview with David Sweat, owner of Nashville landmark Sweat's Restaurant. Ken, Ed, and Phil discuss why we celebrate both Labor Day and May Day, and discuss the SCR strike, United Airlines, Project 2025, Amazon, and more on The Workers' Mic. Gabe and Sam look back at the 1934 Campbell's Soup Strike, when socialist organizations helped workers stand up to a major corporation, on Labor John. Lynn tells the story of Rosina Carruthers Tucker, who played a role in the founding of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, on the Resolved Labor podcast. And the Reimagining Value Action Lab has released The World After Amazon, 9 short speculative stories written by rank-and-file workers at that corporation in podcast format. And where are you going to find links to all of these great shows? At laborradionetwork.org. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Labor Radio Net. We're sending out the latest episodes of Labor Radio shows and podcasts with the hashtag LaborRadioPod. That's it for this week. Back to you, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Harold. Again, you'll find links to all the shows at laborradionetwork.org.
Hello and welcome back to the ILO's Future of Work podcast. I'm Sophie Fisher. The Paralympic Games have just opened in Paris, France. The Paralympics, like the Olympics, are often the high point of an athlete's career. But the life of an elite athlete is pretty tough, even more so for athletes with disabilities. Sporting careers can be short. Many sports don't pay, and even more don't pay enough to live on. Plus, there's the question of working conditions. So, what is life like for a Paralympic athlete? Well, luckily today we have with us somebody who can tell us exactly what that's like, because Josh van der Wies was a former Paralympic athlete and bronze medalist in the 2012 Summer Paralympics in London. He is now co-chef d'équipe of the Canadian Paralympic team. Josh, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, and Josh is in Paris, and here with me in the studio is the ILO's Oliver Liang. Oliver is head of the Public and Private Services Unit in the ILO's Sectoral Policies Department, and his team also deals with the working conditions of service workers, which of course includes professional athletes. So, Oliver, welcome to you too. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Hi, Sophie, and hi, Josh.
What do you think that the Paralympics has done to affect the perception of the general public of people with disabilities in general and athletes with disabilities in particular? Do you think it's enhanced that perception?
Well, I'm always trying to identify which inclusion initiatives actually make an impact, actually move the needle. In diversity work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of the initiatives don't actually do anything, or they make discrimination worse, is the great frustration. And so I do think that the Paralympic Games helps with disability inclusion. It's millions of hits, videos, images, stories of athletes who are proud of their disabilities. And that kind of disability pride is something that people don't often see. I think it's such a startling thing that it really does shift attitudes.
Okay, at this point, let me bring in Oliver Liang. Tell us some of the things that the ILO is doing to improve work-related standards for professional athletes, whether they're athletes with disabilities or otherwise. And, of course, other people in the sports industry, because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Not everybody is an athlete.
Absolutely. It's important, of course, the ILO does work a lot on disability inclusion and the promotion of rights of persons with disabilities in the field of work, which, of course, includes sports. And for athletes in particular, it's a new area for the ILO, but certainly promoting social dialogue is one of our key aspects. For example, there is a collective agreement now between the football unions and the professional leagues in football, which the ILO supports through technical advice on such issues as non-discrimination and occupational safety and health. And we hope to promote social dialogue in other fields as well.
Josh, you've been competing in the athletics industry at a high level for quite a long time now. I mean, what changes have you observed in how Paralympic athletes are supported during their athletic career and, of course, in preparation for life after that athletic career?
Well, there's a real shift. The sports systems of all the different countries are realizing that some active intervention is needed. In Canada, we have Game Plan. It's called an initiative of the sports system, which has all sorts of programming that helps athletes plan for their retirement, for their transition after sport to a career, and helps them with networking and job opportunities. It's completely okay. It's not even neutral. It's positive to focus on your career after sport, to either do your studies while you're an athlete or to plan when you're going to do your studies in your long-term planning. It makes you a better athlete in my view. And so it's about making sure that your whole identity is not wrapped up in being an athlete. It's such an important part of who we are, and it gives us so many transferable skills in the workplace to be competing for the sake of competing, doing work for the sake of doing work. That's something that we really struggle with, athletes, when we go into the workplace. We're used to doing things at 98, 99% of our capacity. And then all of a sudden in the office, everyone's going at 7%, and we're just so confused.
Great. Well, listen, That was fascinating. Thank you so much. But for the moment, that is all we have time for this Future of Work podcast. My thanks to Josh van der Wies from the Canadian Paralympic team and Oliver Liang from the ILO.
There is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. That's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union brand.
To be the only statue in the country built by union members for a business owner. Walter Reuther has a deep history here in Wheeling. He was here for a number of his earliest years.
Walter Reuther's name is forever linked to Detroit, Michigan, where he and his brother Victor built the United Automobile Workers, the UAW, into one of the largest and most progressive labor unions in American history. In Wheeling, West Virginia, where he was born on September 1st, 1907, Reuther is a hometown boy who made good. Each year, for the last 8 years, the Wheeling Academy of Law and Science Foundation has organized the Reuther Pollock Labor History Symposium on Labor Day weekend. The annual event also celebrates the life and work of local stogie maker and union supporter Augustus Pollock. Patrick Dixon and I drove out to Wheeling last Friday to cover the symposium. West Virginia historian Hal Gorby led a walking tour on Saturday to statues of both Reuther and Pollock in a park along the Ohio River in downtown Wheeling. The noontime walk was interrupted by an intense but thankfully brief mountain thunderstorm, so you'll hear the rain and thunder in the background as we took shelter and the intrepid Dr. Gorby continued his local history talk beneath his oversized umbrella.
We're going to go out this way and down the street. Both statues are down by the river. Before we head out, just to note, the two figures that we're sort of looking at, Walter Reuther and Augustus Pollock, both represent sort of elements also of the German heritage here in Wheeling, the strong immigrant history here in this city. Pollock died in 1906. Reuther was born in 1907, so they sort of never crossed paths, but Pollock did cross paths with Walter's father, Valentine Reuther, who was a major figure in the Ohio Valley Trades and Labor Assembly. So we will walk down this way. Walter Reuther has a deep history here in Wheeling. He was here for a number of his earliest years. Actually sort of left to go to Detroit because that was a common thing for people to do. He also had to leave because he tried to organize a union at Wheeling Steel, which was the main sort of corporation here in the 1920s. And obviously, very, very influential, as most of you know, in terms of his role with the rise of the United Automobile Workers Union, the CIO, the involvement of the labor movement in sort of civil rights and the Democratic Party, foreign policy, so many other things.
I am George Jeffries. I am the chairman of the UAW Lima-Torrey Area CAP Council. One of my predecessors, co-chair, Tom Barton, is a UAW historian, self-appointed but UAW historian, and he came here to Wheeling to find Walter's birthplace and to find a statue, and there wasn't one. So he initiated the campaign to get this statue placed here and stuff.
What year was it?
I don't know what year, but it was actually dedicated in 2006. So it was fairly recent history. He went to the county engineer and found the old Reuther household and has the paver bricks that was for the sidewalk and everything, and it's kind of a prized possession. If you're a good, loyal UAW member in the area, you might get a brick from Walter's house and stuff, a Reuther award, yeah. So he initiated that.
They couldn't put it where the family's house was in South Wheeling because it was basically removed when they built the highway expansion.
So Walter Reuther, one of the things that I read recently that he prided himself on is he was the lowest paid international union president in the United States. He prided himself on not being greedy like a couple that were mentioned earlier.
For Labor History Today, this has been Chris Garlock. Thanks so much for listening. Keep making history, and we'll see you next time.
You are listening to 90.1 FM, KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio. Stay tuned for the Heartland Labor Forum, radio that talks back to the boss.
Good evening. I am your host, Zhongjing Li, and on tonight's show, we will be talking to author Debbie J. Goldman, retired from Communications Workers of America. Debbie has a new book called Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Age. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you, Choi-Chin. I'm glad to be here.
I was really excited to read your book, especially when we think about the digital age. Connection seems to be the key word, while your book has the title, Disconnected, right? So that immediately caught my attention. So what was the driving force behind your decision to write this book?
Thank you very much. Disconnected really brings together my work of almost 3 decades in the Communication Workers of America Research Department. While there, I had 2 major assignments. One was to support our workers, our members who worked in the telephone companies, or eventually we'd call them the telecom companies, customer service operations, the service reps, as they were experiencing increased surveillance, speed up, and the degradation of their working conditions, and to help them as they were fighting for good, humane jobs. The second piece of my assignment was I did telecom policy in front of the Federal Communications Commission, Congress, the White House, and also the Department of Justice. And I saw as policymakers substituted competition for regulation as the framework for the oversight of our communications companies. And so Disconnected brings those 2 together, really, in starting from the frontline service reps, how they were experiencing the change that was going on in the larger political economy that was then driving their employers, the Verizons, the AT&Ts, to implement and use digital technology in a way that increased the oversight, took away the autonomy, and created, in effect, a stress epidemic in the call centers. So I wanted to bring that together.
That's great to know, because I think for most of us who are customers, we definitely have experience talking to a call center worker, but we don't know what's going on behind their voices. So your story will really give us a much, much fuller picture of what's going on in this industry and in these workers' life.
I think you've captured it exactly. I say to some of my friends, the question is, will the book help me understand why I grit my teeth every time I have to pick up the phone and call somebody over the phone for service or with a billing question? And the answer to my question, or that question, is yes and no. The yes is that it will help you understand what the policies are that their employers have implemented. And in a union environment, we have some protections. Most call center workers, and in fact, we have about 2.5 million call center workers in the United States, working at about 40,000 call centers, and of course, millions more. So it's not just your call going to India or the Philippines or Bangladesh or Mexico. It's also to the United States. So the yes is that the policies, for example, the employers use the digital technology to collect enormous amount of information about who calls and when and what kinds of calls. And they use that then to squeeze out any downtime and to implement requirements that a call center worker can only be on the phone, let's say, for a couple minutes. And if they're on the average more than that, they can get dinged and disciplined. Now, union call center workers have some protections, but they're still under those kind of requirements. And so the conditions are such that we as customers feel frustrated. We also feel frustrated when our calls are switched from this person to that person to this person, We feel frustrated when we've explained to person A all of our story, and then we have to start again for person B. So all of that is explained.
Thank you for joining us for the first part of our interview with Debbie J. Goldman, author of Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Age. Be sure to tune in on September 12th for the second half of our conversation. Until then, keep listening.
Hey there, welcome back to another episode of CUPE Cast. Are you hoping to learn more about unions or progressive movements? Then you're in the right spot. My name is Brianna Plummer. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Brittany Nisbet, using she and her pronouns, reminding you that we're the only podcast of our kind, combining union info, pop culture, and more, kicking ass for the working class, one podcast at a time. So the LCBO strike.
Yes, so at the beginning of July, it was a bit dry, wasn't it?
The weather might have been rainy, but otherwise it was dry.
Yes, but it was for a very good reason. As many of our listeners know, over 9,000 LCBO workers who are members of OPSU went on strike on July 5th, and this was their first strike ever.
That is such an amazing accomplishment. They literally made history.
Mm-hmm. OPSU had the strike votes in the past, so LCBO members have voted for strike votes in the past in 2005, 2009, 2013, and 2017. But each time after that, they reached an agreement with the employer.
Yeah, and I don't remember or don't know what the percentages were for those. But when they did a strike vote this round, they delivered a mighty 97% in favor for strike action.
Yeah, that's super high. Congrats to them.
This is so good.
Yeah, and it's also important to note for our listeners that before 2005, these workers were represented by the Ontario Liquor Board Employees Union, and in 1998, 2000, and 2002, strike voted were also done then too. So these members are very used to taking a strike vote and what that means and how impactful a high number can be.
Oh, like absolutely. And I mean, you know, when you're going through bargaining, it's quite, I mean, not all of the time, but like I'm speaking from my own experience with my own local for the past 5 rounds. You know, things haven't gone the way that we wanted while we were bargaining. So, you know, you file for conciliation, you take a strike vote. Like sometimes that's just how it goes. So sometimes it's part of the process. But speaking about the LCBO strike, and so while their strike is over, spoiler alert, you may all have known that strike is over. As we mentioned in our introduction, we want to recap it because what we learned from the strike, and we want to discuss the negative impacts of expanding the privatization of alcohol. So like while the strike only lasted 2 weeks, there was a lot that unraveled during that time, and it's important to recap it and go over it all. So I think it was about 680 stores were closed and picket lines opened all over Ontario. Did you have a chance to visit any of the lines?
Actually, I did. So
good, cool.
Earlier in the episode, I did mention I attended CLC school. So part of it as well, as a collective, we went out to one of the picket lines in Hamilton, and we supported the group. What I want to shout out, we had a couple of members from SEIU. They led the rally and the chants, and they said it with such like conviction and so much energy. It was so great. And the LCBO members who were on the picket lines that afternoon really appreciated like the additional support and solidarity that they were getting from us. Yeah.
That's awesome. You probably really like brought in like a breath of fresh air. The picket line, because sometimes it's hard, you know. I mean, I have never been on strike, but I've been to lots of picket lines and talked to lots of people who have been on strike, and it's not easy. It's not easy. So that must have just rejuvenated everybody.
It did. Yeah. Thank you for listening. Sending solidarity.
Welcome to Reinventing Solidarity, a podcast of the journal New Labor Forum at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York. My name is Micah Utricht, podcast host and editor-at-large at New Labor Forum. I speak to EWOC organizer Megan Svoboda about the organization's approach, including how the group functions, how its organizers see EWOC as part of the broader alt-labor current in labor, and why EWOC insists on the importance of seeding organizing opportunities widely without knowing which seeds will sprout. Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. When we started, we weren't completely sure if EWOC would be something that would last. We weren't sure if it was just a project that would be a response to the pandemic. When it started, a lot of people were working from home. We were able to get a lot of support from UE, kind of thinking about the labor side of it. And we spent a lot of time really trying to reach unorganized workers. But we really were focused on supporting people to organize around COVID. As vaccines became available, we started to think that maybe people would stop reaching out to us. Perhaps workers would say they no longer needed this support, but the opposite happened. Vaccines became available and we kept hearing from more and more workers. People were still interested in organizing their work. And in fact, having gone through the experience of working during COVID seemed to make people even more interested in organizing. We would hear from a lot of people who were like, I just went through this harrowing thing. I deserve something better now. So we kept hearing from volunteers, we kept hearing from workers, and we just kept growing. And then the Starbucks workers won the first election in Buffalo, and the Amazon workers won an election in Staten Island. And suddenly it sort of felt like there was an explosion of interest in unionizing at work. And so what we saw was in the early days of EWOC during the pandemic, people reached out to us looking for support organizing around health and safety. After vaccines, people reached out to us wanting more respect and better pay. And then after this moment of unionization, where these two workplaces that had never before won a union election won, suddenly people began to look at their workplaces and think, oh, wow, this place could be unionized also. And suddenly we started to hear from so many people who were interested specifically in unionizing at work. And so we really started to think about how do we support workers in not unionized workplaces to win a union. We are not a union, so we're not trying to unionize people ourselves, but we're trying to support workers who are at the very, very early stages of organizing their workplace to learn what it means to win a union, to learn what it takes to get the skills to connect with their coworkers and execute a plan to win that union. So that's what we do. There have been some really big and exciting wins over, especially connected to these union campaigns. A few just from this last year that I will mention. One was the Austin Pets Alive workers. This is a really large animal shelter that is based in Texas. And they won a really hard-fought union election with the support of a EWOC volunteer who helped connect them with a union in Texas that supported them through that. We also, in Texas, supported a nurse who came to one of our training series. We put these online trainings on for anyone who wants to come. She attended one of these trainings and brought her coworkers, and through the resources we provided, built something and connected with NMU and was able to unionize her hospital, which for us was a really big win because hospitals in Texas are not easily won union fights. We supported some residents at the University of Maryland. This was a really large unit for us. It was 900 people, 900 residents who one of our EWOC volunteers really took a lot of time and supported them through the development of a unit connected with CIR, and recently won the election and is working towards their first contract. Classic bookstores, cafes, all of those good sorts of things, but those are some good big numbers and some examples of some wins that I think sometimes people think of EWOC and they think of small cafes or smaller units, and I think those are some good examples of campaigns we supported that I think have made a really big impact.
To listen to more of the podcast, go to slu.cuny.edu/podcast. And to subscribe to New Labor Forum or sign up for our free monthly newsletter, visit newlaborforum.cuny.edu.
Hey, that's going to do it for this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. Just a small sample of the amazing programs aired over the last week on more than 200 labor radio and podcast shows. They're all part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, shows that focus on working people's issues and concerns. We've got links to all the network shows, laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them by using the hashtag Labor Radio Pod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can be part of the network. You don't even need a microphone. Labor Radio Podcast Network t-shirts are now available. I'm wearing one now. They are union made. You'll find them in all sizes and 2 colors at laborradionetwork.org. This podcast recorded under a SAG-AFTRA collective bargaining agreement. The Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, edited this week by Patrick Dixon. I produce the show, and our social media guru, always and forever, is Mr. Harold Phillips. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock. Stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio Podcast show. We will see you next week.